Welcome. Today we're going to be discussing the technique obscure clause and some of the more important rules, principles, theories, concepts, and strategies of this technique. So let's start out with the concept of options, and let's start there. So if you'll notice, this is often applied minor to our shoulder offset. So we have a couple different options. Let's start out with the lower part of our body first and what we can do there. So we could step away, we could stay where we are, or we could step towards them, which is the ideal phase. So stepping away and stepping towards sound like good options, but the third one doesn't. The one where we're staying stationary doesn't sound like a good option. So why? Because we're not obeying rule number one and we don't have proper alignments. And rule number one is to establish a base. So let's start out with the second option here, the one that steps away. And this brings in the concept of considerations. So if I step away and I want to attack this opponent, I can use both my hands in a very specific manner, using both my shoulder and my elbow as pivot points, and then following up with that left. But that's not the ideal phase. The ideal phase steps towards the opponent, but that brings in other considerations. So for instance, the fact that I was stepping away got me away from both the left and the right, but stepping towards them does not. And I have to worry about that left hand and the right hand because I'm getting towards you, closer to the opponent. In other words, I'm closing the gap. So that means I have to do some different things. I have to make changes on myself. In this case, unlike what we did earlier, where we used both the shoulder and the elbow as pivot points, we want to break up that timing. So what we want to do is create a cover for our face. And that would be with our elbow in this case by going back, by raising that elbow up. It prevents them from touching us. There's another option here where we would want to potentially pin this hand. But remember, this technique is called obscure clause, not obscure claw. And the fact that I engage this hand means the fact I'm not going to be able to get that claw. And notice what happened here. I have to worry about that right hand. So that's why we don't try and pin that hand with my left to their right, because of the fact that it disengages my left hand from the foray going on here. And by not doing that and keeping the hand covered, I can now pick up what's happening with that right hand. So in other words, I could hit them with my right hand and pick up the cover with my left, or I could pick up and then potentially hit them with the left hand. Or in the ideal phase, they don't do anything to us, we can then hit them with both. So let's talk through what's happening here with this elbow one more time so that it's clarified for you. So what we need to do here is pick up that cover with that elbow by raising it up and then using our elbow as a pivot point. So in other words, we're breaking shoulder and an elbow pivot points, which when we do that, we call that a ratchet. Okay, so we get here to do these hits. Now, options of hitting on a straight line or a circle, we could do either in this case, depending upon how we're reading the situation. Remember, that now brings in the concept of reading. We want to determine how we want this opponent to be manipulated by us. We can either hit them back, which straightens that arm, or we can hit them on the shoulder, which begins to bend the arm a little bit more so that we can continue forward. So now let's talk through this piece, the next piece here, but that's, again, like we did at the beginning, start with the bottom part. And let's talk through length of technique. So the ideal phase of these techniques do the long version of this technique. So in other words, we get to this piece, and the idea is to lock up this elbow or this shoulder and this elbow as we begin to step. And what we do, since they're doing multiple steps, is we do multiple steps and we go through this technique. But let's go through the different ranges. That is the long range. There is a short range version of this technique where I begin to lock up that shoulder immediately, and then I can continue on with the technique because they didn't do a step to alleviate the pressure. There's another version where they begin to feel the pressure on the dislocation of that shoulder, and they do a step like that. So what I may have to do is to compensate for that and then do a single step, and then I can reverse back into that opponent, which gives us the middle range. But keep in mind that the ideal phase does that long range. So just a quick review is they do a step, I do a step, they do a step, I do a step, so that we can get ahead of them, so that we can continue that technique going forward. So now that we've gotten to that piece, let's talk about what happens with circles and lines here. So we start out with this motion, and we start a circle, and we can either A, convert it into a line. In this case, we won't give as much of a lock here to the shoulder, and primarily more here to the elbow as we begin to convert this to a line. But keep in mind what we want to do. Kenpo is a lever-based system. If you notice, if I begin to turn this more, I'm taking away his lever while I'm keeping my lever, which is a good thing, which is I don't do it quite as much as if I go to that line. So instead, what I do is I continue the circle in order to remove their lever. Now, the next option we can do is reverse the circle, which is what we're going to be doing. Okay, so there's a problem with what's going on here. You say, well, what's the problem? The problem is we're crossing a center line without using it. That's a general rule. So in other words, I'm coming all the way from this part of the circle, all the way to this part of the circle without using it. In other words, I'm passing this center line, the depth center line. So I can use it by using the concept of inserting. So what inserting is taking something that's normally not in a base motion and then adding something in the middle of it. So in this case, I'm going to be adding this back knuckle so that I get the alignment here for the strike. Now, the next thing we have to think about is how we're doing this strike. The strike is done two ways. Typically, with the way we think about strikes is we have our backup mass behind the strike, which is what we're doing here on this left hand. But now we have to consider what's going on with this right hand. The right hand, we have the opposite. We have the backup mass in front of the weapon. So if you notice, my backup mass is here, and my weapon is here in front of it. And we're doing these simultaneously with one another. This brings in a whole series of new concepts, the most of which is opposing forces. The one that most everybody talks about here is opposing forces. What that means is forces going in opposite directions of one another, in other words, opposing each other. But there's another concept that isn't quite as well thought about here at this point, which is called vice-like maneuvers. So vice-like maneuvers are the same thing. They use opposing forces, sometimes a stationary force, sometimes both of them moving together. But in this case, what we're doing, the stationary force is the one in the middle. And what we're doing is we're doing these active forces going against each other. But you may have noticed something. I did do these in line with one another. They were offset. That is still a vice-like maneuver, but this type of vice-like maneuver is called scissoring. So in other words, think of a scissors where they pass by each other. That's what's happening here. We're passing by the opposing forces by each other, creating that vice-like maneuver. Then what we're going to be doing is we're going to be reversing that line, just like we reversed the circle earlier to deliver our strike. And this brings in the concept of fitting. What we're going to be doing is taking this middle knuckle and fitting it to the bottom of the throat here as we get into this strike. But remember, we're talking about options. Just like in the beginning where we did ideal phase, which is long, and then middle and short, we have options here too. So if I begin to do this hit and the person backs up, I may have to insert foot maneuvers. The concept that is presented here is foot maneuvers are added as needed. But there's a cousin companion to this, companion concept to this, which is body English. So if you think about it, what I'm doing is I'm doing things with my body to enhance the strike. This could be done through the foot maneuvers, or it can be done through body rotations throughout this technique. And that brings in the concept of body English. Now, the final thing to think about here is where we are at the end of this technique. Some of our techniques end in the middle of a fight. This technique does not. We finish the maneuver, and then we can cross out. So now that we've talked through all these rules, principles, concepts, theories, and options, let's show you a quick demonstration of this done at a slow pace so that you can see it. Hope this video helps you understand the American Kenpo system just a little bit better. Thank you very much.